Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hope you're all doing okay. Welcome to today's presentation on presentation design. Glad you're all here. We're going to be talking about ways to improve your presentation design and create those lasting impressions that we want to make with our audience. So it's good to see everybody here today. My name is Justine Sanborn, and I am one of the instructors at Noble Desktop. I do teach our presentation design class, and we actually have one coming up. More details on that soon. But I'll be here sharing some insight on things that you could ultimately apply to your presentations as soon as tonight, as soon as the presentation here is over. And hopefully these bits of information can help you create some really nice, impactful presentations. So we're going to go ahead and get ourselves started with just taking a look at what we're going to cover today. The four main things that we're going to be taking a look at is number one, creating a goal for your presentation. Number two, understand the needs of your audience. Number three, use storytelling to keep your audience engaged. And last but not least, using those design principles that you've probably heard of before in crafting that presentation. So these are going to be four fundamental steps that, again, you can use to improve your overall presentation. There's a lot of pieces that are not included in this presentation here tonight. However, if you are, again, interested in learning more, we do have a class coming up on it. So pretty exciting stuff. I think this is something that oftentimes gets overlooked. And when people are in need of a presentation, sometimes you have a brief moment of time to put these presentations together, to accumulate the information and to assess exactly what you're going to be talking about. But I think that these simple steps can be applied even in those instances where you are developing a presentation very quickly. So we'll get ourselves started with creating a goal. Okay. There are multiple different reasons why you would be creating a presentation. Actually, one second here. You can't quite see the one thing. So let me turn off myself for a hot second. So there you go. There's a couple of things that you might be doing a presentation on, and each of them will make your presentation different. So we've got the options of informing the audience. You might be selling a product or service. You might be educating the audience. You might be inspiring the audience. You might be presenting a report or solving a problem. And more than likely, it's going to be a mixture of multiple of those. So don't just assume like, oh, it's got to be just informing the audience. It could most definitely be multiple things mixed into one. So for example, you could educate the audience and also be inspiring the audience at the same time. Or you could be presenting a report that solves a problem, which is something that happens actually quite frequently with a lot of presentations. With my experience in advertising, the majority of the presentations that I'm developing for my clients involves information that solves a problem, but also relies on showcasing reports and data that supports that problem exists and how the solution will ultimately fix that problem. Okay. So again, in a lot of these instances, when you're thinking about these goals, don't worry about it being just one thing, because it's basically not ever going to be one thing, and that's absolutely okay. All right. But I would strongly suggest making sure that you know exactly what that presentation is for before diving into it. That way you're clearly communicating the intention of your presentation before you get started. Okay. Also, something to consider is don't try to combine too many things at one time. So having two different things, again, presenting a report and also solving a problem, is totally manageable. However, if you were to start mixing maybe three of these objectives together, then the intent of your overall presentation might be confusing to the viewer. So those are some things that you really want to think about as you move forward. All right, your audience. So your audience might be a wide variety of different people. Okay, actually, while I'm talking about this slide, I really want to get to know everybody that's in the stream right now. So hello to everybody that's already typed in the chat. Welcome and nice to meet you. If you don't mind just typing in maybe some things about yourself that you would like to share in the chat, I would love to get to know you all in the chat as we go on and talk about different audiences that you might experience when you're presenting work. So the big thing here is understanding the interests and motivations of people that might be watching or looking at your presentation. So they're going to have different interests and motivations for partaking in it and being viewers, depending on what their position is. So a couple of these are applied, but there's also one that's missing here too, which is what you're all doing, which you're all essentially in a position where you're learning, you're in a learning environment. So you don't necessarily fit into the mold of these four, but these are the four most common audiences that you will experience when you're making a presentation. Okay. Nice. Okay, this is great. I'm getting some comments. I'll be taking a look at those shortly too. All right. So a couple of them that you might be thinking of is number one, you have your stakeholders. Okay. So your stakeholders are main people in your company. They're going to be employees of your company. These are people that are going to be interested in project scopes, challenges, as well as those challenge solutions, as well as the efforts required to get to those solutions. Okay, so a couple of things there with the stakeholders. Stakeholders is a pretty big sort of bubble. Again, it can be multiple different people, but usually it's referring to employees. Then you also have your investors. Okay, if you have investors with a company, usually what they're interested in is market opportunities. Again, those challenges and solutions. Again, your efforts required to solve those challenges and the investment rationale. So why are they investing their money in that company or in that venture? Why are they there? And why is their financial participation important? Okay, so those are things that you clearly want to lay out in those cases. Then you have a team. Okay, so a team could be big or small. Again, it depends on what type of environment that you're dealing with. Usually in this case, what this is talking about is a bit more of a smaller team where you're focused specifically on a specific project. Whereas a larger span of employees, that would fall maybe more under that stakeholder scenario. Okay, so a team is that smaller group of people that you're working with on a day-to-day basis. And in those cases, things that you're going to want to share in your presentations has to do with the project scope, essentially what you're going to be talking about that day. What is the theme of the day? What is the item that you are working on? Again, the challenges involved with that particular item that you're working on. Your goals for that item. Okay, what do you want to reach with what you're trying to apply? The functional requirements. So different things, for example, brand requirements, you have to maybe abide to a specific, I'm just again talking about advertising, so bear with me. But of course, your company has a very specific mission about the company, very specific visuals and voice that they want to be heard. That would be a requirement. Other requirements, of course, can be financial and a time span as well, which is the last one, which is the timeline. Okay. And lastly, on the list, we have customer. So a customer is essentially who you might be giving or selling a product or service to. And ultimately what they want to know is what that product or service is going to do for them. What's in it for them? Okay. Not only what is in it for them, is it going to solve a problem for them? And is that problem solving maybe going to be better than what someone else is already doing for them? Okay. Or is it just simply why your company is better than your competitors? Okay. Which is an even bigger conversation that can lead into a lot of different marketing concepts, just a little pepper of that. But in terms of positioning yourself within the minds of the consumer. It's called market positioning. And you can oftentimes inform your consumers or inspire them in a way that can make them think of your company or your brand as the first thing that comes in mind when they're thinking of that specific type of product or service, which is really advantageous. How to get there, on the other hand, is a completely separate conversation, completely different presentation, but again, some really great food for thought there when it comes to communicating with the consumer. Okay, I'm just going to be reading off some of these comments here. It's really great to see everybody. A couple designers, which is awesome. A couple different, or you work or you present with your training, or sorry, your company and training ideas. Yeah, a lot of internal training content does happen frequently with these companies, and presenting that information in a really straightforward way is extremely important. So that's a really great thing there. Graphic designer. It's a necessary evil, PowerPoint. Yes. It is. As again, working in advertising, I am creating decks on multiple decks on a weekly basis. So your presentations are absolutely. It's like a day-to-day sort. It's almost like clocking in. It's like that necessary component. Yeah, so it is absolutely that necessary evil, as you mentioned. You're an art director in marketing and communications at Stony Brook University. Oh, that's amazing. You're just not too far away from where I am. I'm located in Queens, so that's great to hear. So hello, hi, welcome. And it's good to see that you're here from Stony Brook University. An educator, awesome, me too. That's fantastic. Work as a graphic designer at a journal news in Westchester County. Nice. For about 25 years. Amazing. That's really cool. Hello, happy to join. I'm glad that you're here. Graphic designer, market presentations, and for sales staff. Okay, interesting. So that's a different point of view, that you're a graphic designer making presentations for specifically the sales staff. That's a unique approach that I haven't heard too many instances of. So that's good to see. Changing jobs in the fall from educating to motivating a team at a K through 8 school. Ready up my PowerPoint game. Heck yeah. Yeah, that transition into, or rather from education into leadership, I think is going to be a really great one. But of course, yeah, that does require a lot of PowerPoint presentations. Oh, a church at Webmaster. That's awesome. Cool. Great. Welcome. Owner, designer of Pinebrook Design, graphic design and creative communications in Bethany, Connecticut. Amazing. Love to see it. That's great. I wonder what type of stuff that you're making there, Nancy. Great to hear from you. You also do not care for office software. Yeah, that's valid. It's absolutely something that's a struggle, to say the least, is transferring from these creative applications that oftentimes we're really used to an application that is not built necessarily for a creative output. Yeah, I totally get it. Would like to know more about master pages and setting up a template for the brand identity. Well, hey, you came to the right place. We're not going to be really talking about the application so much today, more about the concept of creating a powerful and impactful presentation. But again, we do have that class that's coming up later this month, actually, and we'll talk about that more at the end of the day. In that class, we would absolutely be talking about master pages, creating templates, and getting that started. That's something that I actually have worked on quite a few times with a couple of different marketing agencies, is creating templates for them. So that's another part of this too, is creating something that people, or rather maybe you, could reuse over and over again. So that's awesome. I'd love to hear from everybody. So thanks for all your comments. It's great to see everybody here and get to know that everybody has a bit of a different perspective. A lot of designers, which is really awesome. I love to see it. I have been in this teaching realm for quite some time, but again, another main focus of mine is advertising and design. Not only do I teach at Noble Desktop, but I do also teach at two CUNY colleges, both BMCC and City Tech, where I do teach advertising. And a lot of those concepts can and do often apply to presentation design as well. So there's that. That's awesome. Great to hear. All right. So let's step into the big thing here with presentations. Okay. The big thing when it comes to creating these presentations is engaging your audience. Okay. And let's be real, a lot of the information that you might be presenting, so circling back to the sales staff, your information that you're probably presenting visually to the sales staff is probably not super exciting, okay? You might have a variety of different charts, a variety of different things that are showing different things like KPIs and sales, etc. Just not super interesting information. So how do you make it engaging? What are words? The way that you're going to be doing that is engaging your audience with the idea of storytelling. Okay. And this can be applied in a lot of different ways. Okay. These are just some very general rules of thumb when it comes to storytelling. However, the way that you build your story can be in a lot of different ways. Okay. So your general story has a beginning, middle, and end, but there's a lot of different stories that have different peaks and waves of peaks throughout the entire presentation. That works really well in cases where perhaps it's a bit longer of a presentation. There is ones where they catch you right at the beginning with something that's really intense and ultimately leave you with a cliffhanger until the very end of the presentation. Something that's actually quite reflective of that idea is to circle over to social media briefly and talk about TikTok. You'll see a lot of videos on that platform where they'll share a story and they'll get you really invested into it. And they'll be like, come back for part 2. You're like, oh, dang it. You end up becoming really invested in these stories. And oftentimes they're not extremely interesting. It's just, you were there and you just really want to know. You just want to know the ending. So that's a really great way to engage your audience as well, as again, starting with that like really interesting story and then breaking it up and then leaving that the ending literally at the end of your presentation. Okay. That can again work really well for sales as well. Just to again, keep them engaged because you do have to show them all of that extra information. Okay. I will say when it comes to engaging your audience and storytelling, there is a specific amount of attention that your audience is going to have when you are presenting. So at the very beginning of your presentation, your audience is there, they're rearing, ready to go. They are completely committed to listening to what you got to say, but they fall off really quick. Okay. It's essentially an exponential line that starts up high and goes down, like I said, real quick, like a roller coaster. At the same time, what you ideally should be doing is starting your presentation maybe a little bit lower and then ramping it up. Okay. So that peak of that presentation ideally is right smack dab in the middle of the presentation. That's going to really hold your audience's attention. That's a very generic, again, way of thinking about your audience's attention and engaging with them. But it's important to be aware that their attention is going to waver throughout your presentation, and that's completely okay and to be expected. Okay. With that being said, there's a couple of things to consider when you are creating or sharing a story with your audience. Number one is, of course, you want to make them care. Okay. Why do they care to be here? Okay. What do they care about? What are their feels about this? Okay. What is their connection? So a lot of you are coming from an instance where you have that background in design, but you have to be working a little bit more in that PowerPoint. Or Joseph just mentioned, have you ever tried Keynote? Yep, absolutely. I've tried Keynote. Google Slides, Keynote, Canva, PowerPoint, all of the above I've used for presentations, depending on who my client is and what my presentation is for. There's benefits and disadvantages to all of the above, but yep, absolutely. All of those. And with that being said, the main reason why you all care is because you want to make that presentation. Okay. Now, number 2, set the scene. Okay. Make an environment for your audience. Make them think about an instance where they could apply this for themselves. Okay. So I keep on circling back to a couple of different examples that you all gave me of what your experience is and who you're presenting to. The reason is to give you that opportunity to visualize how you could apply that in the situations that you're working on individually. Okay. So when you are presenting to your different audiences, really think about things that might resonate with them. Okay. Number 3, use suspense and tension in your story. So that's directly connected to that conversation that I was talking about with the TikTok instance, and come back for part 2. Okay. Using that suspense and tension can really hold your audience's attention, oftentimes for quite a long time. Okay. Oh, awesome. Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Nice to hear it, Rosa. Welcome, welcome. Number 4, know your purpose of telling the story. So know why you're there and why you're talking about it. Have a reason for the story that you're talking about. And last but not least, leave them wanting more. This is especially important if you plan on presenting multiple presentations in a longer span of time. Okay. So perhaps there are instances where you intend on, say, let's make 5 different presentations. You want to make sure that that first presentation doesn't give everything away within the first, presentation. So you want to keep them wanting more, give them that piece that they're looking for, but not the whole piece. A slice, but not the whole pie. All right. A lot of us are in New York. You kind of get that, right? Maybe. Okay. So this is a big one. I think a lot of you here have, again, that design background. And so I think that you probably, for the most part, have a solid understanding of how to use your design principles in crafting your presentation. Okay. Realistically, without them, your presentation is ultimately not going to be as impactful. Okay. I'm actually really excited that a lot of you, or many of you, not all of you, but many of you do have that design background, because I'll give us an opportunity to ultimately critique what we're going to be seeing here next. But there's a lot of things, visually speaking, that can ultimately make or break your presentation. Okay. So these are things that you want to think about when you are creating your deck visually. Okay. And to ultimately avoid, long story short, over cluttering your presentations. You're going to see an example here. Actually, why don't we just go to it right now? Here's an example of what not to do. Okay. All too often we see this type of layout of a slide in a deck, and there's a handful of reasons why it's not working. Okay. If there is something that you think is not working in this slide, feel free to comment in the chat. I would love to hear what your opinions are as well. But I'm going to just start talking about a couple of things that are not working in the favor of this particular slide. Okay. Number 1 is too much. Okay. As soon as I went over to this slide, it's just jam-packed with information. Okay. Depending on your design background, you might be used to creating bigger documents, maybe books or magazines, things like that, where you can put a lot of information into one place, because ultimately your audience is spending more intimate amount of time with that item. Okay. However, with presentations, that is not the case. Okay. When you put up too much information, it's going to ultimately be overwhelming for the viewer. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Way too much text. Way too much text. So there's way too much information. And in fact, I've seen decks where an entire project outline was essentially on one slide. So the problem, the challenge, so it was almost designed like a poster, but it was actually a slide for a deck. And that's really going to be hard for the viewer to read. It's going to be overwhelming. And there are instances where when you're creating these, that it might seem or feel like you have to, right? So you're going to be getting the information from somewhere. And the thing is, you don't have to type out word for word all that information. Okay. I'm going to give an example from a previous student that I had in one of my presentation design classes. And they were working in like science tech. That's the best way that I could describe it with my lack of insight. But the student would inform me of, okay, so these scientists will give me all of this information of this is how you get to the solution from A to Z. And it's all of these different steps to get to this very complex solution. Okay. And these scientists were very adamant of putting everything in these presentations, right? So the designer that was taking my class was having troubles with this information because she's like, I know it's too much. I know that it's overwhelming, but they want all of it there. And that's something that can happen a lot of times in these instances where you might not necessarily have control over the information that you need to provide in these decks. Okay. There are strategies with that too that you can consider, but putting all of that information onto one slide is, again, ultimately going to be too overwhelming. Let me take a look at some of these comments here. If you say or read the slides, then why are they even there? They could read them from home or office. Always add dialogue when you present the information. Yes, absolutely. So that's actually a really perfect insight of why you don't necessarily need that extra information. Okay. You can explain more of what you plan on showcasing verbally. Okay. And give them a general gist of the information that you verbally incorporating so that they can see, okay, they can follow along maybe step by step, and you give more detailed examples of each thing. That is a great insight, Jean. Exactly. So again, thinking about ways of visually reducing the information does not mean that you're reducing the information from the presentation, because you are absolutely more than welcome to share more insight and more detail verbally. But visually, again, yes, that can be overwhelming. A couple of other things to consider with this particular slide is the layout, okay? Specifically, if we focus on the text on the left-hand side, we know that it's a lot, but there's also a big lack of hierarchy, okay? So there is a bold, slightly larger body of text as the title, but it really doesn't stand out that much, and it just kind of blends in with the rest of the information. Additionally, there is no difference in line spacing between the paragraph prior to the bulleted list. So it just seems like it, again, melds in together. So when you are creating these presentations, really think about extending that negative space. We will be talking about that here more shortly. But ultimately, that lack of negative space, especially with the text, the lack of hierarchy, is really making it overwhelming to look at. Okay. Now, the image perhaps you didn't necessarily think at first wasn't advantageous, but the image also isn't working. And it's ultimately because it's not very valuable. It's very generic. It has that white background. We have a businesswoman here, but there is no reason or rhyme or reason as to why she's there. Okay. It's very posed. It's very unnatural. Okay. And those are things that you want to consider avoiding when it comes to having visualizations in your presentation. Okay. If we go back a couple of slides, we have a couple of different visuals here of different instances where people are making presentations. And these visuals look more realistic. They do not look staged, okay? And these are the type of visuals that you're going to want to consider to incorporate in your presentations. A really great place to get royalty-free images that are in a natural environment is pexels.com. Pixabay.com is also another great resource, but Pexels for photography specifically is fantastic. So definitely check out that website. Okay. So we talked about a couple of things that weren't working with that slide. And now here are some things that you can ultimately apply to crafting your presentation that will make it more successful overall. Okay. Again, these are concepts and design principles that, again, if you do have that design background, these are the same things that you learned in design. You're just ultimately applying them in a different way. And I'll be talking about those differences as we go through each of them. Okay. So number one, reduce the text and visuals. As I was mentioning before, considering a larger amount of negative space in your design. Okay. Remember, you're not writing a book, nor is your audience here to read a book. Okay. When you are reducing the text and visuals, something that you can consider doing is that you can consider creating multiple slides. Okay. So if there is a slide that looks like this, then this easily could be bare minimum 3 different slides. Okay. If I was to share all of the same information, this should be bare minimum 3 different slides. It would be a lot more comfortable, however, if it was more around 5, 6 different slides for this amount of information. Okay. Just to put it into perspective of how much information you should have on each slide. Okay. So don't be afraid to separate your information on multiple slides. You do not have to put it all and compact it all in one slide. That's going to be, again, overwhelming. Another thing that you want to think about is hierarchy, and again, that negative space. Ultimately, you want to make important information stand out, and you want to avoid having your slides overcluttered or have too much information going on or too many things for somebody to look at. Okay. And that includes your images as well. Okay. So if you overwhelm your viewer visually speaking, even with design, you're going to be overwhelmed. Another thing that you're going to want to think about is space and balance. Okay. That is one thing that I would say it tends to be a bit different than how you would work with space in, let's say, poster design, or I'm trying to think of another, again, print design, let's say, for example. All right. Some of these ideas that I'm about to state are things that I would apply in a lot of digital design environments as well. But think about how somebody is looking at the information. So a lot of times, actually centering the content can work in your favor with presentations. Okay. If you are choosing to center the information, I still don't think it's advantageous to have bodies of text that is center aligned. Okay. That's going to still be challenging for your viewer to read. Okay. However, things like titles or a small bit of information can absolutely work on a presentation. You are working on a screen, so usually your viewers are going to be, looking at the center. Okay. If it's simple, straightforward, it can absolutely work. A good example of center aligned content that works well in a presentation or just design in general is Apple. Okay. Pretty consistently with Apple's branding, they work with center aligned content. Okay. I actually did a presentation training with an Apple art director. This is a couple years ago, pre-pandemic. And that's exactly what they were doing. They were centering all of their text. Okay. And that's fine to an extent, but their problem was, well, now every slide has center aligned text, which gets dull. It's not interesting. There isn't any variety. Okay. So remember to use variety with your slides as well when it comes to your, when it comes to using space and the layout. Okay. What I generally suggest is, again, something similar to what you would do in a situation where you're creating a magazine. Okay. Or again, printed content. And if you have that design background, you're usually going to be working with a grid system of some sort. That is exactly what I recommend working with when you're making a presentation. Okay. So if you're trying to create different layouts of information and you keep on going to left-hand side, photo on the right, or center text on every slide, consider creating a grid system where you have a bit more variety in terms of where things can go in your presentation. Okay. So grid systems can really help lay out your information in consistent but unique ways. Okay. If you choose to make differences in your layouts without the grid, you do run the risk of those slides being too inconsistent and not looking like they belong together. Okay. So those are some things that you also want to consider when you're making these design choices. Okay. This is a big one. Use infographics. Okay. Infographics, please, all the time, if you can. Infographics are a great way to showcase information, and especially complex information. Okay. So when it comes to complex information and showcasing it, a lot of times your infographic is going to make that information a lot more digestible. Okay, there are a lot of different tools in all of these different applications that can enable you to create these infographics quite quickly and quite efficiently, but also think outside of the box. It doesn't necessarily have to be your tried and true pie chart or your tried and true bar graph. Those don't necessarily need to be the way that you're showcasing information. Okay, one way that you could showcase information is if you were trying to show, let's say, 1 in 10 people do 1 in 10 people in the workplace create presentations. What you could do is you could have an outline of a person, and you have 10 of those outlines. Sorry about that. You have 10 of those outlines, and one of those 10 is white, and then the other of them is green, for example. Okay, that's visualizing the information. That way your viewership can understand it much more clear. Okay, these are a lot of different things that you could do with it. But again, think outside of the box. Honestly, it was kind of a generic idea, but you could, instead of the people, it could be different icons and things. And so that idea can be applied and actually be really visually interesting if you can use different icons for that, again, like 1 in 10 scenario or 5 in 15, etc. Fun, interesting infographics. So again, don't necessarily jump right over to the pie chart or jump right into the bar graph. There's oftentimes different, more unique ways to showcase that information. So always think about that before you create them. Additionally, however, there are a lot of instances where you might be gathering data from elsewhere. So if you are gathering data from elsewhere, maybe you're using a resource like Simmons or something to gather data on or insight on your consumer base. That's probably an instance where you want that resource directly so they know, okay, this is data that's from this specific platform. Okay. Yep. So Illustrator does have a couple of different infographic options. Well, by couple, I mean, I think like 7 or something like that. But these different applications, again, Google Slides, Keynote, and PowerPoint, all 3 of those do offer similar capabilities as well. Okay. And the difference is if you choose to use the applications themselves that you're creating the presentation in, you do have the opportunity to also animate the information, which when it comes to transitions and animations, less is more. Okay. However, when it comes to instances where you are showcasing an infographic, I would say that usually having it animated will be more advantageous. It will be more interesting for the user to look at and experience. Okay. So that would be the one reason why I wouldn't use Illustrator. But I have used Illustrator for infographics, but usually it's for static printed content when I'm doing that. So some food for thought there. All right. As I mentioned with the other slide, again, by other slide, I mean this slide here with our beautiful businesswoman. Beautiful, but very unrealistic. Okay. You want to avoid these unrealistic stock photos because they're just, long story short, not super relatable. Okay. You want a quality photo that ultimately tells your story. Okay. So additionally, if you're just incorporating photos just to have a photo in there, make sure that that photo is serving a purpose. Make sure that that photo is helping you show or tell your story that you're sharing with your audience. Because if it's not, then it also doesn't necessarily have to be there. Okay. So for example, if I did have a photo on this slide, I know it's very simple, but if I did have a photo, there would be really no purpose for it. It would ultimately just distract from the information that I am trying to provide. Okay. So there are instances where, you know what, maybe a photo isn't necessary. Okay. Some things that you do want to think about adding on a consistent basis is your brand or your branding of whatever sort it may be. Have that incorporated on every slide. That way you can see it consistently. Sometimes you want to also incorporate some type of navigation on your slides, okay? That would be an instance if you're doing a really big deck, okay? So really big deck, it can be advantageous to add insight of where the viewer is in terms of the presentation. So a lot of times you see that labeled with like words like intro, background, design, etc. You know, these different sections like tabs, like literal tabs that maybe you would see on manila folders. And it's not that it's terrible, but really the purpose of it is to just inform, again, the viewer where they're at in the presentation. Okay, so they can be like, all right, I'm like 1/3 of the way through, or I'm halfway through. Okay, so something that can actually work better is using different shapes as indicators. Okay, so the most common one is to have circles connected by lines. Okay, and those circles can represent different sections of your presentation if it's bigger, or those circles can represent the slides if it's smaller, okay? And you would just ultimately highlight the circle that you're on, okay? So again, you don't necessarily need that text information to inform the viewer of where you're at in the presentation, okay? What other things did I want to mention there? I think that was about it. So again, ultimately that information about the navigation, it just kind of leads back to that idea of less is more, reduce the amount of information overall on the slide so your consumer doesn't feel overwhelmed. Again, if you have that text, it might be distracting. It probably will be a bit distracting. So avoiding that and replacing it again with just some type of shape is, in that case, more advantageous. All right, so let's take a look at what this could be. Okay, so again, this is the example of what not to do. We talked about the lack of hierarchy. We talked about the lack of negative space. We definitely talked about the fact that there's way too much information on this slide. We talked about the stock photo being too generic and not useful in telling the story. Okay, and those are the main things that we're seeing here with this slide. So let's take a look at what it could be instead. Okay, so what it could be instead. That's a really great question, Rosa, and I'll circle back to that here very shortly. So here is the same idea of information, but the information is reduced. And instead of working with the bulleted lists, the information is put into these boxed bits of information instead. Okay. Additionally, you have this really great wholesome image in the background that actually extends for the entire slide. Okay. So it extends to the entire slide, and we took advantage of the negative space in the photo itself to add in the information. Okay. So with this, do you think it works better? Or perhaps do you have any ideas of ways that it could be improved? Okay. As you think about ways that maybe you think that this could be improved, or ways that you do think that this is working better, again, feel free to type in the chat what your thoughts and feels are. I'm going to talk about, in the meantime, about the length of a presentation, because that's a really great question, and there is not the best answer for it, okay? In a lot of instances, you are informed of the amount of time that you need to give a presentation, okay? So with those instances, you want to ultimately abide to that amount of time that you have available, okay? For example, if I am presenting an idea to a client about maybe an ad campaign, it's not going to be a very long presentation. It is going to be 10, 15 minutes max. Honestly, 15 minutes is too much. When I'm presenting work to a client of presenting them an idea of a campaign, I am going to keep it at 10 minutes, done and done. Okay. However, at the same time, I can give lectures in my class that, similar to what we're dealing with here, that can go upwards of an hour or more, sometimes 2 hours. Okay. Or you might be somewhere in between. Maybe it's a half hour information or a half hour amount of information, etc. Okay. It ultimately depends on who you're presenting to. Is there a time limit? So what is the time that you do intend on presenting? Okay. I think I mentioned who. Let's see. Those are really honestly the two main factors. Okay. Now, if you have an instance where you don't have a time limit, what I suggest doing is, again, looking back at the audience that you're presenting to. Okay. So who is the audience that you're presenting to? And why are they there? Why are they listening? Are they a stakeholder? Are they an investor, etc.? Okay. And adjust the timing for that accordingly. Okay. For example, circling back to the graphic design for the sales team. Graphic design for the sales team, perhaps it's, let's say respectfully speaking, it's a presentation for the sales team that happens on a monthly basis. I think respectfully that, again, if I was not given a time frame, I would say between a half hour to 45 minutes for that. Okay. However, if I was talking to an investor, so not a team, so if I was talking to an investor, again, that's an instance where I'm going to keep it short and sweet, 10 minutes. Okay. I don't want to look like I am there to waste their time. Okay. So just a couple of food for thoughts with that when it comes to the length of presentation. That's a really good point. Yeah, so Berkeley mentioned it's a little too hard to read the font because of the, well, actually, it's not necessarily the opacity. It is completely opaque, but it is a thin version of the typeface. So really good insight there is that ultimately, because the typeface is too thin, it allows the bold typeface to stand out, but it makes the thin typeface sort of just kind of meld into the image. Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. If you are in the back of the room and you don't have 20/20 vision, the projector is not super bright, the light font, yep. So again, that thin font, okay? Thin fonts are something, again, guilty as charged, where visually speaking, close up, as you mentioned, can look great. But as soon as you move farther away, depending on the environment that you're looking at or working in or presenting to, it's not going to be an advantageous choice. Okay, very good. Yep, more agreeing with the lighter font. Fantastic. I'm so pumped that you all picked up on that. Also adding one color for key areas of text. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Now, with the key color of text, I guess the main reason that it's not applied here is maybe the only place where I could see that it could work is layout, where it says, and it's bold, layout and design. Perhaps that would be the instance of where I would incorporate that different color of text. However, usually, and this is granted, some of these things are personal opinions, so take it as it will. But usually when it comes to text that's in a different color, I tend to devote that to information that perhaps is directing somebody to somewhere else, right? Like to see more, go here, or a website link, etc. I guess I ultimately apply that sort of idea of embedding a link. You always see it. Usually, traditionally, it's that blue color and then it's italicized and underlined. Again, that might be from my background and my visual experience that I have just growing up, and I see those different colors and then I assume that it's clickable. So that might be a personal thing, but that's usually why I tend to devote different colors to just things that, again, are ultimately clickable or can be accessed for more information, if that makes any sense. Okay. That doesn't mean that you have to apply that to what you're doing. Okay. I think that adding a different color is definitely something that would work here and could be successful. Yeah, great suggestion. Margin might be too big. Okay. Yeah. So here's something that we want to think about is if the margin, so this actually, I'm glad that you mentioned the margin because that is something that I skipped over on this one, for example. But actually, if we look over in the upper right-hand corner, where the image has a fair amount of space on the edge here, okay, but a lot less amount of space here. If it's inconsistent, it ultimately will look imbalanced, okay? So it would have been better if I actually either moved it further over or moved it down, but I don't have much room to move it down, okay? This is also a bit closer to the edge, but that was ultimately because I was trying to take up, or I needed all of this extra space, okay? If I moved this, let's say up and over to the left a little bit. So like up and over to the left, maybe about a ½ inch. In that case, what's going to end up happening if you did move it closer to the edge is that it's going to look a little tight, okay? And you're going to have too much negative space right around here, okay? So it will ultimately feel a little bit too constricted, okay? And a little bit too much room over here. All right. So I tend to suggest actually to overextend the margins, to force yourself to have more room, quite literally. So if you do have larger margins like this, you are much less likely to fill in that space as well. So bonus points with that. Okay. And that's one of the reasons why I think that having a bit bigger of a margin tends to be more advantageous. Okay, let's see here. I would try to have a photo with the person on the left half facing the text to draw the viewer's eye to the text as well. This woman is looking off the page. That is a wonderful suggestion, Nancy. Yeah, that's another great thing when it comes to photography is that you can use it to your advantage to direct the viewer and where they're looking to actually look and quite literally read the text. Okay, so with that being said, that's actually something that I oftentimes will be looking at when it comes to design is what is the flow of what I'm looking at. And right now, because of what Nancy mentioned, so our model here, let's say, is in fact looking off the page. They're looking to the right now, okay? So even if I reflect it, they would be looking to the left. They're looking off of the page. So what your eye is unnaturally or naturally doing is you're going to, briefly digest this information, but your eyes are going to be kind of doing this like swoop off to the right. And your eyes might not necessarily come back naturally, okay? So if you took Nancy's suggestion of having the model face the presentation so that the model is facing the information, but then also flipped, so the model isn't on the right, but is on the left, they would be quite literally looking at the information, and that would bring your eyes almost in this like circular motion, which is really fantastic. So when you're thinking about the information, you're looking at the design of it, really think about where your eyes are going naturally, okay? Oftentimes when I'm trying to take a look at how the information is reading to a viewer that's not necessarily myself, is I'll briefly look away from what I created, look back at it, and see where my eyes are going, just for a couple of seconds. I'm not reading the entire thing. Again, I'm just going away and then seeing naturally where my eye is going. And what's actually happening with my eyes right now is when I'm looking away and looking back at this particular example, I do start here. That's good. But I do in fact look at the model, and then I do briefly come back here. So there is, I wouldn't say circular motion. It is still sort of working, but that's just for me. Okay. I am not the only one looking at this presentation. So this is actually an instance where I would definitely get a second opinion, like I am in chat, to see how other people are perceiving it. Okay. So just because it might work for you does not necessarily mean that it will work for others. And that's something that you want to keep in mind as well. That also does apply to your audience that you're talking to as well, because they might understand information differently than how you understand that same information. And you want to make sure that that information is as clear as it can be for them. Okay. So it's always important to get second opinions if you have the opportunity to get those opinions, and make sure that you're getting them from, again, people that would be quite literally experiencing these presentations themselves. Again, that's not always the reality for us. We don't always have that opportunity to show our work to the people that we will eventually be presenting it to. But again, if you do, absolutely take advantage of that, because they will give you insight on things that you might not have thought about. Okay. What else we got? Use a medium font would have been better. Yep, absolutely. I love this. Thank you all for the feedback. This is great. And these are things that I want you to think about when you are making your presentation slides and when you are thinking about the design of them and how they're working and how they can be better. Okay. Again, a couple of the things that we thought about with this one is legibility from a distance. Okay. And another one that we talked about is the flow of information and the space of information. So those three things. Okay. All of which can be applied. So great job. Awesome. Love to see it. So here's the deal. We're coming to a close here. I do want to open this opportunity for you all to ask any other questions that you might have in terms of presentation design concepts. Again, if it's any questions in terms of the application, this might not be the most opportune. You're welcome to ask them and I can see if I can answer them verbally. But in a lot of cases, when it comes to application answers, it's better to show than just tell. So that's why I'm saying that. But if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat right now. As I mentioned, we do have a class coming up. I think a lot of you are in the New York City area or close to in Connecticut, which is fantastic. And a lot of you are also interested in getting more comfy with PowerPoint itself. This is going to be the class for you. Okay. So we have an upcoming class on Friday, March 25th. Okay. It runs from 10 to 5 p.m. It could be either or, in person or it's online. Okay. So if you want to join online, that's absolutely okay. We do our online classes via Zoom, so it's really easy to access. You'll have coursework and everything else to go along with it. Again, step-by-step instructions for creating PowerPoint presentations and presentation design. So if you want to learn more, there is the link here. Let me actually just get that up into the chat here real quick. Hold on one second. All right. There we go. There's a link. If you incorporated the guides in the template itself. So if you incorporated the guides, long story short, in the master pages, yes. But if those guides were on one page, then each page you have to create new ones. So long story short, if you plan on creating guides, you want it on every slide, add it to your master pages. Any other questions? Excuse me, sorry. You all have been incredible. This has been one of my favorite online seminars. It's been an absolute delight. You all asked really wonderful questions, and it was a really fun time presenting this information to you. I hope some of it was insightful for you. I think a lot of you, it's more of just applying some, again, of those design principles that you're already using to the work that you're creating in PowerPoint. But it's been an absolute delight, and I'm really grateful that you all have been here. From one file to another. So you can take a master page and ultimately copy it into another file, or you can save it in your actual PowerPoint as well within your Teams. So that's how I would suggest that, if that makes sense, Jonah. Yeah, absolutely, Nancy. And thank you for being here and being so interactive. Again, thank you for everybody who typed in the chat, who asked the hard questions, who stated things that could be improved and could be worked on. These are all things that we want to think about every single day when it comes to design and how to make impactful design. And don't forget that you are sharing stories as well when it comes to these presentations. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week. And maybe I'll be seeing you in a couple of weeks in our PowerPoint